So we're starting this morning with a group that has been sponsored by the Wilson Center, looking at defense procurement, and it's Michael Black, Tess Corkery, Kevin Haynes, Sean Jenner, and Hannah Mail. Take it away. And you have your full 30 minutes. Don't worry.
Thanks, Jennifer. So welcome everyone to our presentation today. We're really excited to be here with you all. Before we get going, we'd just like to do a big thank you to our judges. So to Brenda, Kyle, and John, we really appreciate you providing your feedback and your comments and your questions, and we look forward to them later. To the Wilson Center, who is hopefully joining us online, thank you so much for supporting us through this tumultuous time, particularly to Chris, to Maddie, and to Zavi. To our coach, Vincent, I know you're here in the room. I see you over there. Thank you so much for everything you've done for us. To Natalie for supporting us through this process. Thank you. To our stakeholders, we acknowledge you being here today. The project would not have been possible without you. And lastly, to our audience, we're really excited to share our project with you today, Securing the Future, Rebuilding Canada's Defence Industrial Base for a New Era. And with that, I would love to pass it off to my coworker, Tess, who is going to give us from where we were and where we are now.
Okay, great. So I think before we dive into our research and into our actual recommendations, we wanted to start with a bit of context, because I'm sure everyone in this room has been watching the NATO proceedings. You've probably heard in the news that it's been a historic announcement just in the last couple days of almost $150 billion in defense spending by 2030. So this project has been extremely topical, and I think before we can present our framework for a path forward for defense procurement, we want to start with a bit of context. So I think starting with a reminder is important that Canada emerged from World War II with one of the strongest militaries in the world. So at the time, our defense processes were streamlined, our procurement processes were under a single agency. Our defense industrial base was not only functional, but it was seen as really a key national priority and a point of national pride. And this enabled a relationship with the United States that was one of partnership, of integration, and where Canada really had value and brought something to that partnership. Now, over the coming decades, this has changed. So Canada took a step back from our defense spending in the post-Cold War era, with the United States continuing to invest and bolster their defense industrial base. Really, Canada took a step back and de-invested in our own industrial base, which really created this relationship that was much more one of reliance instead of partnership. And that's something that we've seen play out today. And what it created was a defense industrial base that was hollowed out and unable to meet the needs of today, as well as procurement processes that are fragmented, slow, and risk averse. And so really this is the heart of the question that we were setting out to answer in the fall when we started the project, was how can Canada be a better partner with the United States? So how can we work together to bolster our defense industrial base and once again be that strategic ally? Now, what we absolutely did not anticipate, and what I don't think anyone in this room would have anticipated, is that the relationship with the United States would fundamentally change just in the context of our project alone. So the United States, which was once a key ally, has taken a major step back, not only with their partnership with Canada, but also internationally. And I think has really been a wake-up call, not only for all Canadians, and I know the relationship between Canada and the US was mentioned across the policy labs yesterday. It's extremely vital to who we are as Canadians. But it was also a wake-up call for us with the closing of the Wilson Center earlier this year, who was sponsoring our project. So we've had the opportunity over the last 8 months to redefine the scope of our research, to no longer want to further integrate necessarily specifically with the United States, but to be able to look internationally at new partners and new allies, and also really focus this idea of Canadian nation building and what we can do domestically to revitalize our own industry and ensure long-term security in one of the most volatile security environments of the last 75 years. And not to overstate it, but with an ongoing war in Ukraine, with rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific, and with a conflict that we're seeing play out today in the Middle East, it really is one of the most dangerous worlds we've seen in the last 75 years. And really our defense industrial base cannot meet these needs in its current form. So I'll pass it to Sean to take you through a little bit more about the specific issues that we aim to solve with our framework, so that we can demonstrate sort of a path forward to defense procurement in this new environment.
Thanks very much, Tess. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our summary of key insights and what we heard through our extensive stakeholder consultation process. And we've broken this really down into 4 main pillars. The first pillar is governance. And this pillar focuses on what we heard and what Tess said about our really fragmented, risk-averse, and extremely slow procurement process in Canada. The main thing we need to remind ourselves about that is that if we have a slow procurement process, if it's not effective, our Canadian Armed Forces members and the Canadian Armed Forces as a whole are not getting the really important equipment they need. So that's our first pillar, and we've titled it governance. The second pillar, moving over to the right, is focusing on industry, what we heard, the issues around industry. And this pillar has kind of 3 main parts. The first part is that Canada doesn't also have an idea of what it has within the country. We don't know what industries in Canada, what they're good at, and that also plays back into the government. The industry then doesn't know what capabilities the government of Canada is looking for. If we don't know what we have, then we can assume that there's gaps within that. That plays to the second part of this pillar, which is financing. More than 90% of the defense industry in Canada is made up of small and medium enterprises, and they have faced lack of financing. So that's the second part of our pillar with revitalizing industry. And the third part is another really integral part, is that we're not using our critical minerals and the resources that feed into those industries to make those hard capabilities for the Canadian Armed Forces in a way that is effective and efficient. And this moves on to our third pillar, which is international partnerships. Tess gave you a really, really great context of the tumultuous times that we're facing today with our over-reliance on the United States of America. Currently, we import 70% of our defense equipment from the United States. That's a lot. 70% is a ton. So this pillar really focuses on diversifying those partnerships, as you've heard the Prime Minister say, and really making sure we're not relying on the US. We're also ensuring that we're not going to rely on other allies solely. We want to build up what's good at home, but we know we can't do that alone. So this pillar really focuses on the issues we've heard around over-reliance on the United States of America, specifically related to defense. And that plays a little bit into our last pillar, which is policy and strategy. Currently, we've heard, Canada does not have a defense industrial strategy. Some of the things I outlined at the start would have been included in a defense industrial strategy had we had one. We have also heard that the current strategies that Canada has, the most recent one, Our North Strong and Free, being released in 2024, does not provide the signals to industry, to allies, or provide the correct level of accountability to Canadians that they are asking for. So that pillar really focuses on making sure we have a long-term vision so all of these things can play into that. And that's what we're calling our GRIP framework, to help get a grip on defense procurement, if you will. So now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah, and we're going to be talking about our recommendations under each pillar. So we'll start with governance.
Thank you, Sean. So as you can see here, pillar 1 is in fact governance. So fix what is broken. This is really focusing on streamlining decision-making, delivering faster strategic defense procurement. And to begin our policy lab, we have decided to recommend to establish the Canadian Defense Procurement Agency. Something that we've heard, as Tess and Sean have very much mentioned, is that the problem is the defense procurement landscape currently is very slow. It's fractured, and it's definitely not working for what we have right now. It's not up to the times that we are in right now, and it is spread across a multitude of departments. If I may, I will start with the trifecta of departments that really do govern defense procurement in Canada, which include, as it may be a bit obvious, National Defense. We also have Public Services and Procurement Canada, and we also have Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. On the side, there is Global Affairs Canada, which supports more in export controls. Then there is arm's length bodies, which support as well. There is the Canadian Commercial Corporation, CCC, as well as Export Development Canada. These different bodies come together to create what we know as the defense procurement landscape in Canada, but they do not work in tandem or together very well due to their roles and responsibilities and different mandates that really silo them alone. Another part that has been an issue that we have seen across our research and in discussions with stakeholders is that they suffer from risk aversion, particularly this trifecta that I mentioned to you, the government bodies. Across the government of Canada, we know that there is a culture of risk aversion that exists. For good reason, the government is supposed to safeguard the taxpayer dollars and make decisions in the way that works best for Canadians. But here what we're seeing is it's even more pervasive because of the culture of defense that does not really exist in Canada as we see it in our allies and NATO nations. So right now, there is a large opportunity because of what's happening due to the context that Tess has laid out for us so nicely, that Prime Minister Carney is really honing in on. He has called for a defense procurement agency. He has called for a developed defense industrial strategy, and he has also called for a developed defense industrial base. Although we note many of these things I'm sure you have heard about in the news, including the Defense Procurement Agency, like I just mentioned, it's in the Liberal Party platform. We want to really focus on the how this is done within this policy lab as opposed to the what. And so right now we see a solution here. The solution is to create a Canadian Defense Procurement Agency to really figure out these reworkings of machinery of government. And it should have a very focused mandate, one that is focused on procuring defense equipment for the Canadian Armed Forces, building and maintaining Canada's defense industrial base. It should keep Canada's defense procurement processes effective, efficient, innovative, and accountable. And it should also support Canada's strategic autonomy and the resilience of its national supply chains. Around this Defense Procurement Agency, we would also like to recommend a bit of a change from what we've been hearing in the news around the way that the authority will be streamlined. Currently, there is not one person, as I mentioned, with the multitude of departments that is in charge of making decisions around defense procurement. And so Prime Minister Carney has mentioned that there will be, or he has appointed, I apologize, that there will be a Secretary of State in charge of this. We would like to propose that it should be a minister so that there's no one higher up than this person, other than the Prime Minister, of course, which is a bit obvious. But there should not be a back and forth or more bureaucratic levels to making decisions and to getting things done. This is why we'd like to propose a minister, and this goes back to my comment on how we are scoping the how, instead of the what. Lastly, I would love to point to South Korea as a very great international model for one that Canada would like to follow suit, or just as a precedence in terms of how this is done. South Korea is similar to Canada in the sense that it is a middle power, so we see a little bit of similarity there. We also see South Korea as a strategic point of interest for Canada in its foreign policy, being located in the Indo-Pacific. South Korea used to be made up of 8 different government departments within its defense procurement landscape, kind of similar to what I mentioned with Canada's problem right now. But they have centralized all those things into one location known as the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, known as DAPA, and this has enabled South Korea to become very much less reliant on the United States, a story which Canada is trying to now put forth with its redefining of its economic and security relationship. So with that, kind of setting the ground with this large machinery of government reworking, I'm going to pass it back to Tess to discuss how revitalizing industry can play into this section.
Okay, great. So to kind of reiterate, our first pillar is really focused at governance, which is fixing the overall procurement process, so sort of that overall umbrella of how procurement is done. And we believe that if we can do this, then we can turn to industry to be able to scale up and revitalize our domestic industrial base from fragile supply chains of today to have a resilient national capacity. But before we can do this, we need to address a very critical issue that we heard across stakeholder consultations from industry and government and all the stakeholders that we spoke with. And it's this common issue of Canada does not know what it has. And what I mean by that is that we don't have a fully integrated understanding of the defense industrial base. And because we don't know what we have, it's very difficult to make smart long-term investments and to really be able to leverage industry in the way that we believe we can and that we have before. So again, this problem is that there is a lack of centralization in terms of data. And so what we found is that while data is collected within the federal government, it's done across 5 different federal departments. So each federal department has different data that they use to inform the investments that they're making. And this results in an extremely fragmented procurement process. So the Department of National Defense has a great understanding of the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces, and our Ministry of Industry has a great understanding of, our small and medium-sized enterprises and what their needs may be. But without working together, we can't leverage both, and we can't use procurement as a lever to build up and scale up our industrial base. So the opportunity here is really to treat data as the strategic asset that it is, to be able to centralize all of the data that exists across the federal government under a single agency, which would be, our recommendation is that it would be under the procurement agency that Hannah lined out under the governance pillar. And what this would look like is a comprehensive, up-to-date, real-time analysis of our defense industrial base. Because as I mentioned, currently, I think the one that was most known in government hadn't been updated since December of 2024. So really, it's difficult if we don't have something that is up-to-date and integrated to be able to leverage it to its full capacity. We go into this a bit more in our report around specifically how we can use it, and we wanted to point to the United States as a great example of how this is done. So in the United States, because, again, their defense industrial base is such a national priority, they're able to use the data that they have to target specific investments into the industries that may be atrophying, specifically in terms of workforce, which we believe we could do in Canada. So if we have an idea of what a long-term investment is, but we know that we don't have the people to actually build it, then we can make those investments into industry. And I think overall the point here is that if we know what we have, we can work more strategically with industry to, again, bolster that Canadian nation-building project. And Michael is going to take you through specifically what the funding mechanisms that we've developed are to be able to, again, once we know what we have, actually invest in those capabilities.
So as Tess has highlighted, there's a need to develop some more developed capability mapping tools of Canada's defense industrial base. Once these are established, they can be leveraged to invest more intelligently through our next recommendation, which is the creation of a defense investment fund. The purpose of this fund would be to help develop Canada's defense industrial base, and especially to help small and medium enterprises, or SMEs, to commercialize their solutions and scale up their production when needed. The reasoning behind this recommendation is that in many of our interviews, stakeholders highlighted that there were difficulties in accessing to financing for the defense sector. This is especially pronounced for SMEs, but not unique to them. This is driven by several factors, including the complexity and risk associated with the existing procurement system, as well as the fact that some financial institutions choose to stay out of the defense industry because it's seen as a dirty industry. So to plug these gaps, we believe we could create a venture capital fund focused on defense, housed within BDC, the Business Development Bank of Canada. It already operates certain specialized venture capital funds focused on issues like climate or industrial innovation, so it has the structures and expertise needed to run this type of initiative successfully. The newly created procurement agency would also have a role in the governance, providing guidance to ensure that the investments are well aligned with the procurement needs of the future and the existing industrial landscape. And then this fund would also work in coordination with the private sector, not replacing it. It would always seek to crowd in or attract private capital rather than replacing it. This should also work to try and work well with existing programs. So I'm thinking especially of the National Defence's IDEAS program, which provides grants and other support for innovation. The fund could help to take the prototypes that came out of the IDEAS program and help them scale more successfully and commercialize. This was a problem identified in the program's evaluation. And so this fund can help create a more coherent pipeline from initial research to eventual acquisition by the Canadian Armed Forces. This is based on some international models in France and the United Kingdom, which have funds that operate in a very similar way to what's outlined here. And the size of the fund is also based on this. The French Def Invest Fund started with 50 million euros before being increased to 100 million after a few years. The Canadian Defence Investment Fund could start with $100 million and be increased later if it's deemed to be a success. So here I've outlined some of the ways that we can help bolster the manufacturing side of things, but these will require raw material inputs, which Kevin will now talk to you about.
Thank you, Michael. Michael's outlined how to work with the manufacturing portion of the defense space. But it's important to note that without natural resources, a lot of that manufacturing would not be possible. This leads us to the problem. Canada has neglected its relationship with natural resources. More specifically, consultations and research have revealed to us that two gaps exist in the critical mineral sector. The first gap is a failure to stockpile in a period of intense global volatility. More specifically, if supply chains get disrupted and things like essential minerals are not accessible, the failure to stockpile makes it very difficult for a country to pivot to prepare for a defensive situation. The second gap is about refining. Canada does not refine titanium and gallium, both essential inputs for the aerospace industry. If you look to the globe, China actually produces 98% of the globe's gallium. What this means is that should a NATO nation decide to develop a hypersonic missile system, the gallium that goes into the guidance would have to be sourced from China, the very country that that missile would be pointed at. This is a strategic failure. That said, Canada is good at natural resources. It's in our pedigree. The Prime Minister himself has said that Canada is a natural resource superpower. What we need to do now, going forward, is work with our historically with what we're good at, that is our comparative advantage, so that we can mitigate some of the risk in engaging with industrial policy on the critical mineral sector, in the critical mineral sector. As a result, the recommendation I put forward has two parts. First, it's the creation of a strategic reserve. Now, a strategic reserve is a fancy way of saying stockpiling stuff in a room somewhere. And so should supply chains get disrupted, the industry that needs them at that critical juncture has a source if things go bad. The second is about an offtake. Now, an offtake is a bit more complicated, but more or less what it is, it's a contract that secures a certain volume of a specific material pre-production with one caveat, a minimum price. What this does is it minimizes the risk for investors and private equity, which draws in that investment to help build that infrastructure, which is conducive, which solves the market failure in combination with the government. In terms of costing, one can be forgiven for thinking that this is going to be a lot of dollars. But in the report, the materials outlined, when they're traded in low volume, and when they're used in small amounts. Gallium in hypersonic missiles is used in 1 to 10 gram segments. So going forward, though, Mark Carney has announced that as part of the NATO commitment, we're trying to meet that 5% with investing in things like critical minerals, so there is room to expand. The outcome of committing to the 3 recs that Tess, Michael, and I have put forward is that Canada can begin to pivot its industrial base from a place of supplying components to allies to becoming a co-producer of platforms with them. On the international front, our allies have already begun this pivot. Australia has just announced earlier this year or late last year that they're developing their own strategic critical mineral reserve. It's time that Canada step up to the plate and make strategic autonomy more than just a promise, but a guarantee. Back to Michael on international partnerships.
So as outlined here, Canada needs to take a more sovereign approach to defense procurement and industrial policy, but we believe that international partnerships are also essential for this, and we are going to outline here a new approach that can help reduce dependence on any single partner. Canada, of course, cannot sustain a full spectrum defense industrial base, a problem shared by many allies, and which has historically been resolved by relying on imports of equipment from the United States, which does have the scale to do this economically. However, this creates excessive dependence, which recent months have highlighted the downsides of this. We believe that by working in small groupings of like-minded and industrially capable allies, Canada has the opportunity to develop a new model of partnerships focused around co-development and co-procurement to avoid its dependence. These partnerships can allow all the partners to achieve the scale needed to do this economically, increase each other's strategic autonomy beyond what can be done with pure imports, while also leveraging each other's areas of excellence to build capabilities. There are a few key areas where Canada can pursue these partnerships, the first one being Europe. Prime Minister Mark Carney committed to joining the Rearm Europe initiative, which seeks to bolster European defense industrial base. And earlier this week, already signed an agreement that lays out the first steps in doing so. In the Indo-Pacific, which is a key area of interest for Canadian foreign policy, there are also a lot of opportunities. The first one being AUKUS Pillar 2. AUKUS is a security agreement between Australia, the UK, and US. Pillar 2 being focused on technology, an area where Canada can actually bring a lot to the table. And I think this partnership is also essential for showing that this is not about abandoning the US, but rather just taking a new approach that includes the US, even if it's to a lesser extent. And then the final partner that we think would be especially interesting for Canada is South Korea, which has a strong and growing defense industrial base and has already expressed interest in working with Canada on areas including submarines. All of this will be housed within a broader strategic framework, which Sean will outline to you now.
Thanks very much, Michael. So we've made it to our fourth and final pillar, which is policy and strategy. And this pillar is really making sure that Canada's strategy drives capability. Our recommendation under this pillar is the creation of a National Defence Strategy Act. As I outlined at the outset of the presentation, Canada currently does not have a defence industrial strategy, and the strategies that it does have, like the one you see on the screen, are not providing industries and our allies and Canadians with clear signals as to where we are going. If you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, like more than 90% of the industry is in Canada, if you want to make those capital investments, you likely want a clear signal from the government that those investments are going to be safe. This act, we hope, plays into that and absolutely does that. So the opportunity here is because of our increasingly volatile security environment, this act would anchor some of the other recommendations in longer-term planning. So the act would mandate that we have a defense industrial strategy, a national defense strategy, and associated implementation plans. And the act would basically provide the framework or the template for government to input its content into to ensure that the autonomy of the executive branch is still maintained, but there is accountability to Parliament for the act. We do have some models that this is based off of. In 2019, Canada released the National Housing Strategy Act, which is quite similar in form to this, but of course a very different issue. And France, Sweden, and the United States also have similar acts. However, they're much more prescriptive. So we outlined in our report how we feel this act would fit into our Canadian parliamentary system. Moving on to, I'm sure what all the economists in the room are wondering, how much is all this stuff going to cost? We kind of have a running joke in our policy lab that Vincent has been sending intel on our recommendations to the Government of Canada because 2 weeks after we finalized our recommendation, the Government of Canada announced a sweeping $9 billion investment in defense. 3 of our recommendations fit under this $9 billion pillar, so totaling amount of $4.56 billion. The procurement agency, part of that $2 billion that the government announced as part of that total $9 billion package would be included, as well as some other procurement for the Canadian Armed Forces, $560 million to capability mapping, and the government has steadfastly announced that $2 billion will be put towards diversifying our partnerships beyond just the United States. Our new spending, we feel, is very, very modest compared to the above. So as Michael mentioned, our Defense Investment Fund would be around $100 million to start, to see how that fund goes to get it set up. Our critical mineral reserve and offtake mechanism would be initial investment of $34 million. And finally, our policy and strategy pillar that I briefly outlined to you, we feel would most likely be associated with the existing structures that are already in place within the Government of Canada, as the bills are normally passed in Parliament. All right, to wrap it up, moving forward, we want to quickly again go over our GRIT framework. Our first pillar, governance, focuses on really making sure that our Canadian Armed Forces can get the equipment it needs fastly, in an efficient manner, and that prioritize a made-in-Canada approach. The second pillar, revitalizing industry, directly relates to our first pillar. We want to have that made-in-Canada approach. We need to revitalize industry to ensure we can buy those things that we need. SMEs need financing. We need to ensure what capabilities we have in Canada. And those first 2 pillars, and somewhat the fourth one as well, directly relate to our I pillar, international partnerships. If we can fix what we have wrong going on at home, we can show our international partners that we can be a strong ally, that we can be capable, that we can be credible, and that we can be a resilient ally, because we can't do this alone. We have talked about our diversification from the United States, and that's exactly what this looks to do in part, but not fully relying on another ally. Like I said, we need to fix what's wrong at home as well. So all of these pillars work together in coordination to fix the broader industry of defense in Canada, to ensure that we align defense, economic security, maintain our strategic autonomy, and really ensure we build a defense industrial base that is ready to face the challenges of the 21st century. And we'd now be happy to take your questions.
Great. Talk about relevant. And you too, like our team from yesterday, the White Helmets, was rolling with many changes while you were doing your Policy Lab. Brenda, are you going to kick us off from the jury?
Yep, I am.
Okay,
Thanks.
great.
That was a terrific presentation. And a couple of the things that I really loved about it is it was both broad, like it really covers the spectrum, and deep. So you didn't stop at a few ideas. You actually fleshed them out in a way that we could really understand. So congratulations on that. And the other thing I always love about, choosing your public policy pitch is finding a window that's open and not, as many of us have to do, kind of struggle pushing on a string. Well, there was both luck and planning, I guess, on your part that all of a sudden the Prime Minister thinks that what you're doing is critically important. And really there's no better time to be pushing on something with some specifics. So congratulations on that. The thought that goes through my mind as you're talking about all of this is you've mentioned what we will do in Canada and about growing our own community and about making funding possible and being competitive and innovative and all that kind of thing. And also it's happening in other countries. But there's also other organizations that make the amount of money that we're talking about seem relatively small, even though we're talking about tens of billions of dollars over a long period of time. So I'm thinking in particular about NATO has something very similar to what you're thinking about here, which would probably, I know they're just thinking aloud really, about pre-qualifying certain companies or technologies, partnering with innovation, etc. And the amount of money that they have, I would think we could use your program to complement and to feed into that and to draw from that to even amplify an already ambitious program that you're thinking about. So I just wonder if you've thought about that or how you would see integrating this into another pot of both strategic initiatives, but also dollars.
Yeah, so I think a core part of our presentation is the idea that there's a lot of that has to be done in Canada, but also a lot that has to be done in conjunction with what happens abroad. So I think I definitely agree with you. There are a lot of NATO mechanisms that can be leveraged. There's the NATO supports and procurement agency. They have the Defense and Innovation and Accelerator for North Atlantic that was created recently, and I think they're going to have a hub in Montreal. So I think Canada definitely has to plug into those, but I think there has to be a combination of some things like the investment fund that are a little more domestically focused and other mechanisms that are more international facing, because there's international programs tend to be a lot more complex. There is a higher degree of risk associated with them, and then there's also the factor that there are also some priorities that Canada will place more weight on than others. So I think if you want to get a really holistic, really address these problems holistically, I think you need to have a bit of both, and they play off of each other in many ways. So, yeah.
Fantastic presentation, really enjoyed it, and hats off to put this together when so much is moving at the global level. We didn't think we'd see that much change from just a couple of months of Donald Trump's second presidency, so congrats on that. I kind of have two questions. One is, first, I really like the idea of the 4 pillars, the GRIP as you call it. I'm curious if you were asked, and maybe Vincent will get you an invite to meet the Prime Minister soon, but if you were to advise the cabinet, obviously you'd like to do all 4 at the same time, but based on your research and your discussions, which of the 4 do you think has to be the absolute priority that you would advise the government to focus on first? And second, you mentioned about this massive new increase in funding. Prime Minister Carney mentioned that critical minerals would be a way to fund this, but we also know that Canada doesn't build mines or can't mine these critical minerals as fast as we'd like. So I'm curious to know if you had any discussion in your interviews about where some of the money up front going to come from, and what are the public policy difficult decisions are going to be made by the federal government to actually increase the defense budget. Well, where are they going to cut, or where perhaps did you hear that they might cut? Thank you.
Yeah.
So for the first question, it's the industrial pillar, and this is simply about triage. Our allies are begging for munitions, for weapons, for things that are hard capabilities. So in terms of the domestic front, the things like governance and the things like strategy, they help us domestically, but our geographic security, our threat assessment is not the same as, let's say, a Baltic state. So what we have to focus on now, if it is a matter of triage, is getting the goods where they need to go. In terms of the critical mineral portion, so the Prime Minister has announced that we have to commit money towards the NATO commitment of 5% involving that critical mineral strategy. Where that money is coming from, I'm not quite sure right now, but I do know that that commitment is there. Regardless, $34 million is a low risk, high benefit investment, in the sense that if these rare earths or if these things like gallium do get cut off, that is the precise moment we will need these products the most. I think the government has to find the money under the pillows, in the dresser, or maybe even the shoebox. I don't know, but we're gonna have to do this some way or somehow.
I might just add too, I think on the second part of your question, I think really speaks to the heart of what we're proposing in terms of where the money is going to come from and the industry that we're focusing on. And I think that has been a priority of this government, is very much that these are investments that we are already making. And a lot of the investments are in our own national capacity and in our industries that will have economic benefits, not just for the defense industry. And I think that that is really critical. Another point that they've been making is that it is the change now between needs and wants, and we're no longer at a place where we can continue to de-invest. It really needs to become a national priority today. And I think investing in industry and investing in the Canadian defense industrial base is a way to sort of meet both of the needs that you've identified. So thanks.
John, yeah.
Yeah, very good work. Thank you very much. I worked in the U.S. government for 20 years, although I'm not an American. And one thing that was habitual in the U.S. government was looking at best practices in industry. And that's easier in an environment where a significant number of senior officials were in some sort of industry until the current administration. Any attempt to improve government should look at best practices in industry. Very large companies, the Airbuses, the Toyotas, obviously have government scale procurement systems, and they have to keep their supply chains resilient and lubricated and functioning. Any lessons learned that came up from industry? That's the first half of my question. Another completely different. Oh, and by the way, you're up against a Canadian political class that is not particularly literate in industrial matters. So it's harder to talk to a Canadian government and political class about industrial and economic topics. It just is. Than in many other countries, particularly the US or South Korea, where that stuff is just in their muscle fibers, right? Completely different thing. A complaint I heard from a senior military officer of long service who did a lot of buying was he was trying to hit too many policy targets. I don't just have to buy bandages, the bandages have to support a regional equity strategy. They might have to support some agri-food, they have the fiber might have to be grown, who knows, right? But I have a whole bunch of policy targets that my procurement decision is trying to hit. Any comment on that? It seems to me that one of the ways you could simplify the task here is to reduce the number of policy targets you're trying to hit when you buy something.
I can start and feel free to add. So I think in terms of your first question, so lessons learned from industry, absolutely. So I think the industry component was critical to our project. And really the number one thing that I would say, and feel free to add, that we heard from industry is that there is not an adequate link between industry and government. So government is not giving industry the signals that it needs to be able to make long-term investments. So I think it's navigating the procurement processes with the federal government. Again, as Sean mentioned, the majority of our defense industrial base is small and medium-sized enterprises. And if you don't have an entire team dedicated, like an entire legal team essentially dedicated to going through our entire procurement system and understanding the right person to speak to at the right time in the process and when you need to make the bid, and it's extraordinarily complex for industry. And so I think that was the number one thing that industry needed addressed, especially from the government on top of all of the funding issues. And I think it's ultimately clarifying the process and providing that link, which we believe a legislated national strategy and a comprehensive capability mapping system would be able to achieve. And I'll let you add.
To add to that, when consulting with industry, specifically in mining and aerospace, the mining side was very concerned about a strategic reserve out the gate. Because for things like steel, copper, these high volume goods, there's a huge market for it internationally. To stockpile it in Canada may not make sense, might be a huge risk. That's the motivation for getting us down into the sort of small quantity critical mineral, like these rare earths, things like gallium, tungsten, neodymium, praseodymium. All these things are used in pretty small amounts in things like EV batteries, drones, stuff like that. So in order for us to sort of do this, so for best practices, the idea is that we consulted with the mining industry to ensure that on the supply side, these things are readily available to be stockpiled. Then on the aerospace side, that's where offtakes come in. Because aerospace firms, if they want to buy titanium alloy for airframes, they got to go to Russia, China, USA, Japan. So if there's a volatile environment with the US, which is kind of dicey right now, although it's calmed down, Russia and China are adversaries, we're only left with Japan. So for our aerospace industry in Quebec, that's a huge strategic risk. It would be directly within their interest to do it, and I do think it's in line with best practices.
I'm going to ask the audience to get ready for questions. I know there's a couple people that already want to ask, but we go to our sponsor first. And I think our friend Chris Sands is online. Hi, Chris.
Hello, how are you all? I'm
Good
sorry
to
not to have a
see you.
tie.
It's all right. It's all right. We still welcome you anyway. And is Maddie there as well?
Yep.
Great. So if you've got comments or questions for the team, we'd love to hear it before we go to the audience.
Sure. Maddie, I'll lead on and hand off to you.
Go ahead.
Excellent. First of all, I was so impressed by this project. I mean, it was sort of a challenge that I was wrestling with, trying to convey to people here in Washington that A, Canada can do this kind of thing well, and B, that it can handle the full range of complexity. It doesn't just need to write checks to American defense contractors and solve the problem, but Canada can actually be a source of real input. And what I like about the work is how confidence building it is. I would love to take a version of this paper, walk it around first Washington to say, look, this is what Canada can do. I mean, it knows it has problems. Canadians are smart. They can figure this out, and they've got grit, and they've got determination, and they can get this done. But then, having done that, I would have to walk around Ottawa and say, stop beating yourselves up. You guys can do this. You just have to be a bit smarter about the way in which you take on all of these challenges at once. And I feel almost like the challenge we're facing is not knowing it's important, but knowing that we can do it and believing we can get it done. And this is really a thorough, well-researched bit of work. I don't think Mark Carney, although he says he'll fire non-performing civil servants, I don't know that I can convince him just to hire the 5 of these guys, but that would be my my vote if it was possible. If not, then maybe I could convince the U.S. defense community to hire them as consultants to advise the Canadians on how to get it done, because this was a brilliant team, great work, thorough. Thank you all very, very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Maddie.
Yeah, you guys have done great. This is amazing. I feel so bad. Last time I saw y'all, it was probably September, and a lot has happened since then. But you guys have absolutely knocked it out of the park on this. It's unbelievable. And I had a question that I think can kind of fit. Looking at one of the Canada's things, I was recently at NORAD, Northern Command, and one of the big things that we kind of talked about and focused on was the Arctic and updating infrastructure specifically with NORAD in the Arctic. But kind of looking through this and looking through your different pillars, where would you kind of look at the idea of the modernization of infrastructure and the updating of this? Where would that kind of fit? Because, I mean, the industrial base needs modernization as well. This is something that industry has talked about, but especially along with critical minerals, but bases and production opening in the high north. So kind of, did you guys discuss this? Did you look into it? And where would it kind of fit into what pillar? Does it kind of fit into multiple pillars? That's kind of my question. Also, once again, fantastically done. I'm so proud of you guys. And we're cheering you on from Washington.
In terms of the Arctic, it was a consideration. We discussed it thoroughly. But the fact of the matter is, I guess you could say when you brought up critical minerals, it raises a good point about dual use infrastructure. So Mark Carney has stated in his recent announcement that we need to build the stuff to get the crap out of the country. So when you look at dual use infrastructure for critical minerals, it's very convenient that a lot of these deposits are in the high north. So by enabling the industry through offtakes, you can work with private equity and government policy to develop both the capacity that is strategically relevant, but it comes with the side benefit of that Arctic infrastructure. In terms of bases and things of that nature, it's difficult to see the direct connection between industrial policy procurement and a military base. It seems to be more like strategic planning. There were options that we considered, ports in Churchill, Manitoba, Grays Bay on Baffin Island. There was a lot of work done into looking into that. But at the end of the day, this project is about industrial policy and procurement, and we just didn't really have space to fit that in, though that is a fantastic question, and it's something we deeply considered.
And thanks for the question, Maddie. If I may just add on to that, I think the Arctic really, and to Kevin's point, can fit into this framework. You know, there's a lot of other things that are happening in the Arctic. Kind of the decision we made to shy a little bit away from it is because a lot is already happening in the government of Canada, specifically related to the Arctic. You know, Global Affairs Canada released their Arctic strategy. The Coast Guard has an Arctic strategy, as well as National Defense's new policy update, Our North Strong and Free, is pretty much all focused on the Arctic. However, the framework that we laid out, you know, revitalizing industry, we are going to need things that can survive in the Arctic, whether that's military equipment, and that can be built in Canada. But we need to determine where that can be built in Canada. And then with our governance pillar, we need to be able to procure that in an effective way, in a cost-efficient way, and in a way that adds on to Canadian industry to scale them up. So we really do feel like it does fit into the pillar, kind of, and then directly to your question, the reason we didn't focus on it specifically, number one, a lot of work is already being done, and number two, it could have been kind of a whole project on itself, just focusing solely on the Arctic.
Okay, so we started 5 minutes late, so we'll give this team till 12:20. I know Christy wants to ask a question. I've also got Taylor, Jennifer, Tim, Vincent. Okay, I'll try to keep track. Christy, would you like to go first? We'll give you the microphone.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask you a question as though you were presenting to my cabinet, if that's okay with you guys. Yes. But I do want to start by saying this is fantastic. You guys have really produced some quality work here, and the fact that the Prime Minister came up with it after you, and he's a pretty smart guy, suggests that you are all pretty smart people. So, of course, the big picture is absolutely spot on. I completely agree with where you're going on that. And then, you know, you talked about we need to map it, we need to refine it, we need to stockpile it. The problem Canada has is how do we get it out of the ground? Because our permitting process, our federal-provincial relations, the requirements and obligations, moral obligations we have to work with First Nations, mean that we have trouble with investment attraction, and because nobody wants to invest in projects where they don't know if they're ever going to be approved. And we also, you know, and then as a result, we can't get the product out of the ground to do any of those things. So I guess my question would be, how do you envisage this project fitting in with the rest and finding connectivity in like the major projects office and other necessary areas of government where it's going to be really vital to make change in order for the rest of all the things you envisage to come to fruition?
Great. Who wants to come in on that?
As Mark Carney has been sort of in his prime ministership, he's announced a couple things that we've done. Impact assessment approvals and permitting approvals was on the hit list for us. But with the reforms to the MPMO and the fact that like the province of Ontario is trying to create special economic zones and the Ring of Fire, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes, we think that that's meaningfully addressed by the current government. However, on all the other things about connecting, like what happens after the permit is approved, that was largely not spoken about, what research has told us. So the changes are already in place to sort of speed up the permitting, the impact assessments, making sure that provincial assessments are taken or not duplicated with federal assessments. It's just that the government is doing it. So to duplicate that effort, I think we could focus more on what happens after.
And I might just jump in like really quickly there on your question about change. Like you talked about changing those processes. I think the government has announced that they want these changes to happen. Like Hannah said, they're announcing that Canadian Defence Procurement Agency. That's a big sweeping change that's going to take time. And I think this issue will absolutely take time as well. To your federal provincial part of your question, I think that really plays into the rhetoric we've heard out of the Prime Minister, that they're trying to cut those interprovincial trade barriers by July 1st, which the deadline's, I think, coming up. So we'll see on that.
It's
Do
next
you,
week.
do you see the Deputy Minister for Procurement? Stephen Fair is doing that job now, right? And I agree, the little minister thing is dumb. But if he became, would you see that becoming its own ministerial position, or would you see an assistant deputy minister specifically dedicated to that role under the current minister?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think what we've been discussing is we've really mapped out the way that we want the agency to look like. One thing that we've spoken about is the deputy minister of that agency should be very much like someone who's been doing procurement for a long time, and then beneath that there would be someone in charge of acquisition overall. In terms of how does impact assessment feed into that, we know that, for example, NRCan is doing a lot on that, and we didn't really feel like it made sense to pull it all into this agency because of the reasons around keeping it mean and lean. Like when you start to bring in all these different elements, you bloat this agency. That's the problem already, right? There's too much going on. So we did see it in a multi-phase approach where the first part would really be taking in what needs to be done right now. I think, as you said, like time is everything and it's gonna take time, and that's something that was a limitation around this recommendation. Phase 2, we didn't map it out completely, but something we envisioned, for example, is there's a Crown Corporation that works on defense construction, right? They could then become and report to that agency. Similar things could be done through a gap analysis to see if impact assessment around critical minerals or around these kinds of major projects would make sense to feed in here.
Okay,
You guys are amazing.
I think we might run up against time challenges, so I'm going to take two at a time. I'm going to say Taylor and Jennifer, if you guys could ask your questions, and then I've got Tim, and I'm missing the other person I had, Tim and Vincent, and there may be others. Maybe let's see how we do. But Taylor and Jennifer first.
I'm hesitant to break up this grilling from the premiere. This was really entertaining. I kind of want to see it keep going. Where's this going to go? It's. Certainly, yeah. Maybe yours. You never know. Okay, I can't believe I'm about to say these words, but I'm old enough to remember when we really were worried about securitizing everything, and particularly about using a military frame for issues to get them resources and to make people think they're important. Yeah. And I wonder, when you looked at what we're about to do, put $150 billion into the sector, how you put bounds around that when you were thinking about where that money should go. Like just yesterday, our AI minister said he's going to put money in the AI sector because of its military potential, right? Like that's how he's going to pick winners. So like, where are the bounds here? How do we build our military without just securitizing everything?
Okay, so don't answer yet.
Oh.
Yep.
Jennifer?
Thank you. Great job. I was so impressed by the level of detail that you brought to this. I feel like I've learned so much about gallium. Really.
So have we.
My question is, when you're thinking about building Canada's defence industrial base, how would you advise policymakers to think about what we mean when we say a Canadian defence company? So, for example, Lockheed Martin operates in Canada. They employ 1,000 people. General Dynamics operates in Canada. They also have employees here. So how should policymakers be thinking about the purpose of the defense industry and the ownership of that? Thanks.
I'll
Okay,
start with,
back to you.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'll start with Taylor's question. I think scoping it around defense and the military, it comes in and out. Like we've seen it before, we're seeing it now. I'm sure it will go out of fashion again depending on the times, right? I think like especially from what Tess laid out, at this moment in time, it's actually necessary. It's not something we want necessarily to do, but it's a need. I take your point in saying that it's a guise to get things done and to get things forward. Things do need to get done though. Like we see that nothing has been done and Canada has de-invested or has just failed to mature and continue to grow this industry, and we're suffering because of it. People don't, or not people, but nations don't want to work with us. For example, in AUKUS, that's one of our recommendations. Do they want us there? How can we convince them? We need to start really investing at home so we can be taken seriously. I think if this can get things done, there is a trade-off, of course, and that was something we were speaking about. When you spend so much money on X over here, well, what is going to suffer because of that? If you can couple these things together, and that's why we put a lot of emphasis on the economic side of things, because we want Canadians to understand it's not just about the military and it's not just about fighting wars and procuring guns. It's also about how can we revitalize certain communities, or how can we revitalize certain areas of Canada that have actually been left desolate. Like, if you go to some of these areas, you can see that they have not been developed in a way that we might be putting money into other countries to develop them, right? So there are these kinds of trade-offs, but I think at the end of the day, it will be more of a benefit if you can see the holistic picture, like Michael was talking about earlier. Maybe I'll pass it to Sean.
I'm adding a lot today, and I'm sorry, this will be maybe my last comment, but I just wanted to add one thing on you, where are the bounds of that, and specifically to your relation on the investments in AI. We talked a lot in our initial research about dual use infrastructure and dual use technology. I think it can be seen as an asset because using that those defense funds to feed into AI, that doesn't mean that it's just going to do AI just for defense. There could be technology developed just for AI for defense, and that could feed into the broader architecture that can be used for other industries, whether that be AI. And also on the point of the $150 billion price tag, that is 100% a lot of money, which is why we want to focus that money back into the Canadian economy. If we're uplifting our Canadian industries, those small and medium-sized enterprises, that's creating jobs, which feeds into the economy, which puts food on the table, allows people to buy housing, all of those really important things. So that's why we talked a lot in our presentation about that made in Canada approach. Totally, it's a lot of money, but we don't want all of this money to continue to be going to the United States, and where I gave you that figure of spending 70% of our defense imports to the United States. We want to try to, yes, diversify our partnerships, but also spend that money here at home. And like Hannah said, really revitalize those industries to give us the broader economic benefits that we can get.
Yeah, so I'd just like to address Jennifer's question on, what is a Canadian company? And, I think it's kind of touches on the fact that, it's a lot of the time with these large multinationals, it's not clear, like, do they identify with any country at all? So I think the core consideration here is, like, kind of who and where is, like, ultimate control located for any given system. So looking to the Rearm Europe initiative, a lot of the funding that's been promised under that, one of the key conditions is that ultimate, like, design authority, so who has, like, the control over the design, who can legally license it out, who can restrict its use, that needs to be located in Europe. And I think using that type of that concept, I think, is kind of the key here, because there's a lot of, like, defense is a heavily regulated space. States are very involved in it, and the American ITAR, International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, is a big concern, because a lot of the time systems that have even very small amounts of components designed or sourced in the United States could then be restricted for export or use or sale later on, even if the US is not directly involved. So I think the key concept here is that it's, like, not subject to those types of foreign restrictions, and then the ownership doesn't have to be purely Canadian, but, like, the idea is that there's limited restrictions from foreign actors and more from Canadian actors. So, yeah.
Okay, we are bumping up against time, so I have to ask Tim and Vincent to ask their questions very concisely. And the answers will have to be quick, but we can continue them over lunch. So Tim, Vincent.
Yeah, great presentation. Yeah, I thought it was, and I learned a lot. I guess a question I wanted to ask was, all the emphasis has been on the role of government, basically in getting the information, planning, and basically directing. Obviously, in a lot of areas of the economy, we looked at the private sector to innovate and to look for opportunities, and sort of wondered how you see the sort of mix of public and private ideas and initiative coming through this plan. And I guess a particular area of that is defense exports, because presumably a lot of these industries, if we got new activities, they would need to export to get enough scale to be able to do this efficiently. So question is is that all going to be sort of centrally planned through your partnerships with allies, or are you also going to have some role for private companies to be sort of looking for opportunities to export?
Okay. And I'm sorry to Sean Jenner, but we have to wrap up. I know you're online. Maybe you can type. Oh, that's Sean Jenner. Sorry. Yes, of course you're Sean Jenner. Yes, what am I saying? There was a Sean Jenner. I didn't think. There you go, Vincent.
Great, thank you. So I'll make this easy. I won't actually ask a question because I've done nothing but fire questions at them for the last 18 months, and they've answered all of them brilliantly. They really were great today. One of the great things about the Policy Lab is really it shows students that the policy process is not a straight line from point A to point B, and it's very, very straightforward, and it's very, very easy. It's about creativity, it's about adaptability, it's about resilience at the end of the day. And I just wanted to say that this group has really been a poster child for that. So a couple of you have hinted at all the things that you've gone through, and you guys yourselves hinted at it, but it was really quite incredible from that initial question, which was all about cooperating with the U.S. and defense industry and what we can do more. And then Trump coming along and turning that on its head, threatening to annex us, and you suddenly realize that we've got to be more creative. We've got to think about other sources here of defense industrial cooperation. And then losing your sponsor, Chris Sands has been a tremendous resource, and out of his own time, quite generously, has continued to support you. But we lost the Canada Institute. You lost the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre, which was doged. So it disappeared off the face of the map. And all the resources at the Wilson Centre you lost as well. And then to have that pesky government come along and steal all your thunder with all of these recommendations, which I did not leak, I promise. I used to chase leakers down the streets of Ottawa back in the day. But it was quite something, and I have to say, you guys were unbelievably creative, because I remember, Michael, you and I talking about the Defense Procurement Agency. You wrote an article on it 6 months ago about this is the way it should go. So I just want to highlight that for everybody. Unbelievably creative, unbelievably adaptable. Well done.
Thank you, Vincent. Good. Okay, very quick answer to Tim's important question about the role of the private sector.
Yeah, so I'd like to say, I think the bottom line here is that there's a big role for the private sector and government. I think the role of government has to be much bigger than any other sector of the economy, just because of the nature of defense. But I think a key idea here is that in some ways, we're increasing the role of government through, a more centralized procurement agency that does deliberate industrial policy. But in other ways, we also want to give the private sector more opportunities to engage with things like opportunities to make proposals to government, which is quite difficult to do right now. More early engagement with industry, more listening to their needs, and so I think it's more government heavy than most of the economy, but I think there's a mixed approach here.
Okay, more to discuss. Great job, team. Tess, Kevin, Michael, Hannah, Sean. I didn't know your last name. You see, that's why I thought you had your hands raised. Wonderful job. Congratulations.
Thank you.